The day I decided to disappear from my children's lives was a Tuesday. It wasn't a dramatic, storm the gates kind of decision. It was quiet, like the slow turning of a page in an old, forgotten book. It happened right after I overheard my son, Mark, tell his sister, Susan, that my savings account was essentially their backup inheritance. He said it with such casual entitlement, as if the money I'd painstakingly saved over 40 years of scrimping and saving, of darning socks and reusing tea bags, was already his. As if I were already gone. But I wasn't gone. I was right there, in the next room, watering the African violets I'd nurtured for a decade, and in that moment, something inside me, something I thought had withered and died long ago, began to bloom with a fierce and terrible beauty. For as long as I can remember, my life has been a tapestry woven with the threads of other people's needs. I was Claire, the keeper of schedules, the mender of broken toys and broken hearts, the quiet engine that kept the family running. My home was the hub, the central station where everyone came to refuel and recharge before heading back out into their own busy lives. My days were a predictable rhythm of chores and small kindnesses. I'd wake before the sun, the smell of coffee brewing a familiar comfort in the quiet house. I'd pack lunches for the grandkids when they stayed over, always remembering who hated crusts and who needed extra cookies. I'd tend to my garden, a small patch of green that was my only real sanctuary, my hands finding solace in the rich, dark earth. My husband, Robert, had been gone for 10 years, and in his absence, my role as the family matriarch had solidified into something more akin to a live-in service provider. I was the default babysitter, the emergency contact, the keeper of family traditions that no one else seemed to have time for anymore. I cooked the Sunday dinners, the Thanksgiving turkeys, the Easter hams, my kitchen filled with the aromas of love and obligation. The family would gather, filling my small house with noise and laughter, and I would watch from the periphery, a ghost in my own home. They'd talk about their jobs, their vacations, their latest acquisitions, their voices a blur of self-absorption. They'd ask me how I was, a perfunctory question that didn't wait for an answer, their eyes already scanning the room for someone more interesting to talk to. I remember one particular Sunday, just before the incident with the savings account. The whole clan was there: Mark, my eldest, a successful lawyer with a wife who looked at my hand-me-down furniture with thinly veiled disdain; Susan, my daughter, a whirlwind of social engagements and yoga classes, who always seemed to be in a rush; and their children, my grandchildren, who were more interested in their phones than in their grandmother. I had spent the entire weekend preparing. My back ached, my fingers were raw from chopping vegetables, but my heart was full of a hopeful anticipation that was, in hindsight, utterly naive. I served the pot roast, the one Robert had always loved, its savory aroma filling the dining room. They ate with gusto, their plates piled high, their conversation flowing around me but never including me. I was a waitress in my own home, refilling glasses, passing the gravy, clearing plates after the meal. As I stood at the sink, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, I listened to them make plans for the following weekend. A trip to the coast, a wine-tasting tour, a new brunch spot they were eager to try. Not once did they think to include me. Not once did they look toward the kitchen and see the woman who had made it all possible, standing there, her hands chapped, her heart slowly breaking. It was a familiar ache, this feeling of invisibility. It had been creeping upon me for years, a slow, insidious tide of neglect. I had become a fixture, a piece of furniture they expected to always be there, silent and unassuming. My opinions were rarely sought, my stories were often interrupted, my needs were consistently overlooked. I had poured my entire life into this family, into these people who now looked right through me. I had sacrificed my own dreams, my own ambitions, on the altar of their happiness, and what did I have to show for it? A quiet house filled with the ghosts of yesterday and the painful awareness of my own insignificance. I would often sit in my armchair in the evenings, the house silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and wonder where Claire had gone. Where was the young woman who had dreamed of traveling the world, of writing a novel, of learning to paint. She had been lost somewhere along the way, buried under a mountain of diapers and carpools and PTA meetings. She had faded into the background, a pale watercolor of a person, her colors washed out by the vibrant hues of her children's lives. But that Tuesday, as I stood there listening to my son plot the premature distribution of my life's savings, something shifted. The quiet resignation that had been my constant companion for so long began to curdle into a slow-burning anger. It was a foreign feeling, this heat in my chest, this tightening in my jaw. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt wrong, and as I carefully placed the watering can back on its shelf, a single, resolute thought took root in my mind: this is not how my story ends. The ghost of Claire was about to learn how to howl. The Easter that year was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of domestic artistry. I had spent weeks planning it, a desperate, last-ditch effort to weave my family back together, to remind them of the bonds that I felt fraying with each passing day. I'd dyed dozens of eggs in shades of pastel, their delicate shells gleaming like jewels in the handcrafted baskets I'd assembled for each of the grandchildren. The house was a symphony of spring, with tulips and daffodils brightening every corner, their cheerful faces a stark contrast to the growing unease in my heart. The dining table was a vision from a magazine, set with my best china, the silverware polished to a high shine, and a centerpiece of fresh flowers that had cost me a small fortune. I roasted a lamb, studded with garlic and rosemary, its succulent aroma filling the house and clinging to the curtains. There were scalloped potatoes, a vibrant asparagus tart, and a 3-layer carrot cake with cream cheese frosting that I'd decorated with tiny, edible flowers. I did it all myself, of course. Susan had offered to bring a bottle of wine, a gesture that felt more like an afterthought than a genuine contribution. Mark's wife, Jennifer, had simply texted, "See you around 2." As if they were gracing me with their presence. They arrived in a flurry of activity, their voices loud and their energy overwhelming in my quiet home. They oohed and ahed over the decorations, praised the food with a detached sort of appreciation, and then, as always, retreated into their own little worlds. The adults talked business and vacations, their voices a low hum of self-importance. The teenagers were glued to their phones, their thumbs flying across the screens, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light. My youngest granddaughter, Lily, was the only one who seemed to notice the effort I had made. She was a quiet, observant child of 12, with my husband's thoughtful eyes. She came into the kitchen as I was frantically trying to get everything on the table at once, her small hand finding mine. "Grandma," she'd said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the boisterous noise from the other room, "everything is so beautiful. You made it all so special." Her words were a balm to my weary soul, a tiny spark of light in the encroaching darkness. The day passed in a blur of forced smiles and strained conversation. I was the conductor of this chaotic orchestra, making sure everyone had what they needed, my own plate of food growing cold on the counter. By the time they left, leaving behind a trail of crumpled napkins, half-empty glasses, and a mountain of dirty dishes, I was bone-tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your marrow, a weariness that has nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with a depleted spirit. As I stood at the sink, the water washing over my aching hands, the silence of the house pressed in on me, amplifying the hollowness in my chest. A few weeks later, Mother's Day dawned, bright and sunny. I woke with a familiar flutter of anticipation, a stubborn hope that this year would be different. I laid out my favorite dress, a floral print that always made me feel a little younger, a little prettier. I waited. The morning bled into the afternoon, the silence in the house broken only by the ticking of the clock. My phone remained silent. No calls, no texts. I told myself they were busy, that they were planning a surprise. I watered my plants, tidied the already immaculate house, and watched the hours crawl by. By late afternoon, the hope had curdled into a familiar, bitter disappointment. I logged onto social media, a habit I had picked up to feel more connected to their lives, and there it was. A picture posted by Susan. The whole family, minus me, was gathered at a trendy new restaurant by the beach. They were all smiling, their faces glowing in the sun, raising their glasses in a toast. The caption read, "Celebrating the best mom in the world. Happy Mother's Day, Jen. We love you." Jennifer, Mark's wife, was beaming, a corsage of pink roses pinned to her designer blouse. I stared at the screen, the image burning itself into my brain. It wasn't just that they had forgotten me. It was that they had replaced me. So easily, so thoughtlessly. I was not even a footnote in their celebration. I was simply erased. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, jagged shard of glass in my chest. I felt the air leave my lungs, a silent scream trapped in my throat. I was invisible. A ghost in my own family. That carefully constructed facade of familial devotion, the one I had so desperately clung to, shattered into a million pieces. The love I had poured out so freely, so unconditionally, had not been returned. It had been taken for granted, and then, ultimately, discarded. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the glow of my phone casting long shadows on the walls. I scrolled through years of photos, a digital graveyard of my own making. Pictures of me holding their hands as they learned to walk, of me beaming with pride at their graduations, of me cradling their own children in my arms. I had been there for all of it. The triumphs, the heartbreaks, the mundane moments in between. I had been the constant, the anchor, the unwavering source of love and support. And in the end, it meant nothing. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the ruins of my broken heart. The silent heartbreak was over. It was time to make some noise. The final straw, the one that broke the back of my long-suffering silence, came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A conspiratorial whisper I was never meant to hear. It was a Tuesday, a few weeks after the Mother's Day debacle. I had driven to Mark's house to drop off a book I thought his youngest son might enjoy. I used the key they had given me for emergencies, letting myself in quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. The house was still, and I assumed no one was home. I placed the book on the hall table with a little note, and was about to leave when I heard their voices coming from the study. Mark and Susan. Their tone was low, secretive, and I froze, my hand on the doorknob. "The market is prime for it now," Mark was saying, his voice confident, assured. "If we pool our resources, we can get in on that new tech startup. The returns could be massive." "But we don't have that kind of liquid cash, Mark," Susan replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. "Not without selling something, and you know how I feel about touching my portfolio right now." There was a pause, and then Mark said the words that would forever alter the landscape of my life. "We don't need to touch our portfolios. We've got Mom's savings. The high-yield account she has with the credit union. There's over 200,000 in there. She never touches it. It just sits there. It's basically our backup inheritance, anyway." "You think she'd just give it to us?" Susan asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. "Give it to us? Susie, we don't ask," Mark chuckled, a sound that was utterly devoid of warmth. "I've been helping her with her online banking, remember? I have all the passwords. We can borrow it. Structure it as a loan from her to our joint investment company. By the time she even notices, we'll have doubled it, and we can put it back. She'll be none the wiser. It's for her own good, really. That money is just losing value sitting there." I stood there, rooted to the spot, the doorknob cold against my palm. My breath caught in my throat, each word a hammer blow against my already bruised heart. It wasn't just the blatant, audacious theft they were planning. It was the callousness, the utter lack of respect, the casual dismissal of my autonomy, my very being. I wasn't a person to them. I was a resource. A bank account, a backup inheritance to be plundered at their convenience. The love and trust I had placed in my son, the one I had taught to be honest and kind, felt like a cruel joke. I had given him access to my financial life out of a desire for him to help me, to protect me in my old age. And he was using that trust as a weapon against me. The betrayal was a physical sensation, a coiling serpent of ice in my gut. It was a revelation so profound, so devastating, that it eclipsed every other hurt, every other slight I had ever endured. This wasn't just neglect. This was a calculated, predatory act. They saw me as old, out of touch, and, most importantly, easy to manipulate. They weren't just forgetting me on Mother's Day, they were actively plotting to use me, to drain me of the security I had so carefully built for myself, piece by painful piece. I backed away from the door, my movements silent, furtive. I crept out of the house, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I got into my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I drove away, my vision blurred by a hot, angry torrent of tears. It was a different kind of crying than the silent, sorrowful weeping I had done on Mother's Day. This was a cry of rage. A cry of violation. All my life, I had made excuses for them. They're busy. They have their own lives. They don't mean it. But there were no more excuses. I saw them clearly now, stripped of the gauzy, sentimental filter of a mother's love. I saw them for what they were, selfish, entitled, and utterly devoid of the empathy I had tried so hard to instill in them. The hurt was deep, a wound that I knew would never fully heal. But beneath the hurt, something else was stirring. A cold, hard resolve. A fire was ignited in the ashes of my disillusionment. They thought I was a doddering old woman, a relic to be managed and exploited. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The game had changed. And I was about to write a whole new set of rules. The following Saturday, the phone rang. It was Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she usually reserved for when she wanted something. "Mom. How are you? I was just thinking about you." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before replying, my voice carefully neutral. "I'm fine, Susan." "Great. Listen, the reason I'm calling is that little Timmy's summer camp tuition is due, and things are a little tight this month. You know how it is. I was wondering if you could possibly help us out? It's only a couple thousand. We'll pay you back, of course." In the past, I would have said yes without a second thought. I would have felt a pang of guilt for her financial tightness and immediately offered to transfer the money. But the woman who had stood silently in that hallway, listening to her children plot against her, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone I was just beginning to get to know. "No," I said. The word was small, but it felt monumental. It landed in the space between us with the force of a slammed door. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. What did you say?" Susan asked, her voice laced with disbelief. I said no, Susan, I repeated, my voice stronger this time, firmer. "I'm not going to give you the money." "But why not?" she sputtered, the sweetness in her voice replaced by a sharp edge of indignation. "It's for your grandson." "My grandson is your responsibility," I stated calmly. "My financial situation has changed, and I am no longer in a position to provide that kind of support." "Your financial situation has changed? What does that even mean?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You're fine. You have that big savings account you never touch." The serpent of ice in my gut coiled tighter. "My savings account," I said, my voice dropping to a steely quiet, "is my business. And it is no longer available for discussion. Or for loans." The conversation ended soon after that, with Susan sputtering a mix of angry and confused sentiments before hanging up on me. It was the first boundary I had ever drawn with my children, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The backlash was swift. An hour later, Mark called. He didn't bother with the pleasantries. "Mom, what's this I hear about you refusing to help Susan out?" "What's gotten into you? It's not like you need the money." "Whether I need it or not is irrelevant, Mark," I replied, my newfound resolve holding steady. "The answer is no. And while I have you on the phone, I've been meaning to tell you that I'll be handling my own online banking from now on. I'd appreciate it if you would forget you ever had the password." His silence was colder, more menacing than Susan's had been. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Mom," he said, his voice low and threatening, "but you need to stop it. We're your family." "Yes, you are," I said, a wave of sadness washing over me despite my anger. "And it's a shame it took me this long to realize what that truly means." I hung up before he could reply. The silence in my house was profound, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. The negative reactions, the anger, the sense of entitlement in their voices, it didn't weaken my resolve. It solidified it. It was the confirmation I needed that I was doing the right thing. They weren't angry because they were worried about me. They were angry because the ATM was closed. They were angry because the resource they had taken for granted was suddenly, inexplicably, unavailable. That weekend, I felt a strange mixture of fear and empowerment. I had rocked the boat, and I knew there were storms ahead. But I also felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: self-respect. I had spent a lifetime saying yes to everyone else and no to myself. I had silenced my own needs, my own desires, my own voice, for the sake of a peace that was, in reality, just a quiet form of oppression. By saying that one small word, no, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming myself. I had drawn a line in the sand, not just for them, but for me. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that I was no longer a supporting character in their stories. I was the protagonist of my own. And the next chapter was going to be all about taking back control. The Monday after the phone calls, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. The fear and sadness were still there, lingering like morning fog, but a bright, determined sun was burning through. My first call wasn't to a friend or a relative, it was to a name I'd found in the phone book under financial advisors. A woman named Sarah. Her voice was warm and professional, and when I explained, in vague terms, that I needed to restructure my finances and secure my future, she didn't pry. She simply booked me an appointment for the following day. Walking into her office was like stepping into a different world. It was sleek and modern, a universe away from my cozy, chintz-filled living room. I felt a pang of intimidation, a voice in my head whispering that I was just a silly old woman who didn't belong in a place like this. But then Sarah came out to greet me, a woman probably the same age as Susan, with a kind smile and intelligent eyes. She listened, really listened, as I told my story. I didn't hold back. I told her about the Easter dinner, the Mother's Day post, and the overheard conversation in the study. I told her about the phone calls, the entitlement, the years of feeling like an unpaid servant. By the time I finished, tears were tracking down my cheeks, but they were tears of release, not of despair. Sarah didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She offered solutions. "Claire," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "what they plan to do is not just immoral, it's illegal. You have every right to protect yourself and your assets." For the next 2 hours, we went over every penny I had to my name. The savings account, the small portfolio Robert had left me, the deed to my house. It was empowering to see my life laid out in black and white, to realize that my years of frugal living had resulted in a security I had never truly appreciated. It was my security, not their backup inheritance. By the time I left her office, I had a plan. We moved my savings into a new account at a different bank, one my children knew nothing about. We set up new passwords, new security questions, new everything. The sense of relief was immediate and overwhelming. The next step was harder, but even more necessary. Sarah recommended a lawyer, a man named Mr. Davis who specialized in estate planning. Mr. Davis was an older gentleman, with a calming presence and a sharp mind. I sat in his quiet, book-lined office and told him I needed to revise my will. The original document, drafted years ago when Robert was still alive, split everything equally between Mark and Susan. "I want to change it," I said, my voice not wavering. "I want to leave the house and the majority of my savings to my granddaughter, Lily." He raised an eyebrow, a silent question in his gaze. I didn't need to explain the whole sordid story. I simply said, "Lily is the only one who has shown me genuine, unconditional love and respect. She sees me, Mr. Davis. The others see a bank account." He nodded slowly, a look of understanding on his face. "In that case," he said, "we should also discuss a living trust and a durable power of attorney. It will protect you and your assets while you are still alive, ensuring that your wishes are followed and that no one can make financial or medical decisions on your behalf without your explicit consent." The words were a shield, a fortress of legal protection that I was building around myself, brick by brick. We spent the next week drawing up the new documents. I created a trust with specific instructions. A small, fixed amount would be left to Mark and Susan, enough to prevent them from contesting the will on the grounds of being completely left out, but not enough to reward their behavior. The rest, the house I had filled with so much love, the money I had saved so diligently, would go to Lily. I set up a trust for her education and her future, to be managed by Mr. Davis until she was of age. It was a way of ensuring that her kindness, her gentle spirit, would be rewarded, that she would have the opportunities I never did. Signing those papers was one of the most profound moments of my life. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was the architect of my own legacy. I was taking back control, not just of my money, but of my narrative. I was ensuring that my life's work, my sacrifices, would benefit someone who truly deserved it. I walked out of that lawyer's office and into the bright sunshine, feeling taller, stronger. I had secured my finances and my future, but more than that, I had reclaimed my power. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was the one holding the map. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my journey was just beginning. The decision to sell the house came to me in the middle of the night, about a week after my visit to Mr. Davis. I woke up with a jolt, the familiar silence of the rooms pressing in on me. But this time, it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the sound of emptiness. The house, once the vibrant heart of my family, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life that no longer existed. Every corner held a memory, and most of them were now tainted with the bitter taste of betrayal. The dining room where they'd ignored me, the kitchen where I'd toiled for their benefit, the hallway where I'd learned the ugly truth. It was a beautiful prison, and I suddenly knew I had to be free. The next morning, I started researching. I didn't want a lonely apartment. I wanted life. I wanted community. My search led me to a place called Willow Creek, an active senior community about an hour's drive away. The brochure showed pictures of smiling, vibrant people, of beautiful grounds with walking trails, a swimming pool, a library, and a list of clubs and activities that made my head spin. It looked less like a retirement home and more like a college campus for people with a lifetime of experience. The thought of leaving my home of 40 years was terrifying. But the thought of staying was suffocating. With a surge of adrenaline, I called the realtor Sarah had recommended. Within a month, the for sale sign was on my lawn, my house was in escrow, and I was packing up a lifetime of belongings. The process was a painful but necessary purge. I sifted through decades of accumulated stuff, each object a story. I packed the things that brought me joy, my books, my gardening tools, the photos of Robert and a young, happy me, the hand-painted teacup Lily had given me for my birthday. The rest, the bulky furniture that my children had never offered to help me move, the endless collection of serving platters used for family feasts that would never happen again, the boxes of their childhood memorabilia I had carefully saved, I let go of. I had a massive estate sale. It felt liberating to watch strangers carry away the physical remnants of my old life, to turn those ghosts into cash. Moving day was a blur of chaos and emotion. I drove away from the old house without a backward glance, my car filled with a few precious boxes and my heart filled with a potent mix of terror and hope. Willow Creek was even more beautiful than the brochure. My new home was a small, sun-filled bungalow with a little patio garden, just perfect for me. It was clean, it was new, and most importantly, it was mine. It held no ghosts. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The quiet was different here. It wasn't the quiet of loneliness, but the quiet of peace. I could hear birdsong instead of traffic. I saw my neighbors out walking their dogs, gardening, or heading to the community clubhouse. People smiled and waved. They introduced themselves. There was Margaret, a retired history professor with a wicked sense of humor, and David, a widower who taught a woodworking class. One afternoon, feeling a little adrift, I wandered into the community library. It was a beautiful, light-filled space, with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. The smell of old paper and ink was like coming home. I saw a sign on the bulletin board, "Volunteers needed." On impulse, I signed up. The next day, I was shelving books, the familiar weight of them in my hands a deep and abiding comfort. Volunteering at the library gave my days a new structure, a new purpose. I wasn't just Claire, the forgotten mother and grandmother. I was Claire, the library volunteer. I helped people find books. I read stories to children from the local preschool who visited once a week, and I started a little gardening corner with books on horticulture and a display of plants from my own patio. I was useful again, but this time, it was on my own terms. My contributions were seen and appreciated. I started to join in. I took a water aerobics class, feeling the delightful buoyancy of the water wash away my stiffness and my anxieties. I went to the Friday night movie screenings in the clubhouse. I even signed up for a beginner's pottery class, my hands, so used to dough and soil, now learning the feel of cool, slick clay on a spinning wheel. I wasn't very good at it. My pots were lopsided and crooked, but I laughed. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, a genuine, unburdened laugh that came from deep within. It was the sound of a woman waking up. I was discovering not just new hobbies, but new parts of myself. I was discovering joy in my own independence, in the simple act of choosing my own day, my own activities, my own life. This wasn't just a new beginning, it was a rebirth. The library was my sanctuary, but the Writers' Club became my salvation. I saw the notice pinned to the same bulletin board where I'd found my volunteer post, the Willow Creek Wordsmiths. All levels welcome. Join us to share your stories. The word stories resonated deep within me. I had a story to tell, a story that was churning inside me, demanding to be let out. The young woman who had dreamed of being a writer, the one I thought had vanished decades ago, was stirring. Walking into that first meeting was more nerve-wracking than moving to a new community. The room was filled with about a dozen people, all a little gray around the edges like me, holding notebooks and pens. Margaret, the retired history professor, was there, and she gave me a welcoming smile. The group was led by a woman named Eleanor, a former journalist with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. The theme for the week was a turning point. Eleanor went around the room, asking each person to share something they had written. I listened as people read poems about grandchildren, short stories about their travels, and memoirs about their careers. Their words were honest and brave. When it was my turn, my heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't written anything down yet, not formally. The story was still a raw, tangled knot in my chest. "I don't have anything written to share," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But I have a story I'm thinking about." "Tell us," Eleanor said, her gaze encouraging. And so I did. I didn't name names. I didn't go into every painful detail. I simply spoke about a woman who had spent her life as a caregiver, who had faded into the background of her own family, and who had recently realized she needed to write a new ending for herself. I talked about the feeling of being invisible, of being taken for granted, and the spark of anger that had finally ignited a change. When I finished, the room was silent. I looked down at my hands, embarrassed, certain I had overshared, that I had brought down the mood of the entire group. But then Margaret reached over and placed her hand on my arm. "That's a powerful story, Claire," she said softly. "And I have a feeling a lot of us in this room can relate to it." One by one, others nodded. A man across the table spoke up. "My kids are great, but they're busy. Sometimes you do feel like you're just waiting for them to call." Another woman added, "It's the invisibility that's the hardest. Like you've done your job, and now you're just supposed to be quiet." It was a revelation. I wasn't alone. My pain, which had felt so specific and so personal, was part of a larger, shared experience. That night, I went back to my bungalow and I started to write. The words poured out of me, a torrent of suppressed emotion and unspoken truths. I wrote about the ache of loneliness in a crowded room, about the bitter taste of a forgotten Mother's Day, about the cold fury of betrayal. I didn't write it as a memoir, but as fiction, creating a character named Eleanor in a nod to our group leader, and letting her live out my story on the page. Writing became my therapy. Through my character, I could explore my anger, my grief, and my burgeoning sense of empowerment in a way that felt safe. I could be brutally honest on the page in a way I could never be in real life. I brought my pages to the Writers' Club each week, and with each chapter I shared, I felt a piece of myself healing. My fellow wordsmiths became my trusted confidants and my biggest cheerleaders. They offered gentle critiques, celebrated my small victories, and, most importantly, they understood. They saw the truth beneath the fiction. I rediscovered my love for language, for the simple, profound act of putting one word after another to create a world. I started reading again, not just the light fiction I used to skim, but poetry, biographies, great novels I'd always meant to get to. My mind, which had felt sluggish and fogged by the monotony of my old life, began to feel sharp and alive again. I was engaging with ideas, with characters, with the vast, beautiful world of literature. The lopsided pots from my pottery class sat on my windowsill, imperfect but joyful reminders of my willingness to try something new. But the pages piling up on my desk were something more. They were my reclamation project. I was taking the scattered, broken pieces of my past and reshaping them into a narrative of strength and survival. Through the act of writing, I was not only healing my past, but I was also creating my future, a future where my voice mattered, where my story had value, and where I was, finally, the author of my own life. Life at Willow Creek settled into a comfortable, enriching rhythm. The community I had hoped for blossomed into something more wonderful than I could have imagined. My friendships, forged in the library, the Writers' Club, and the water aerobics class, were different from any I had known before. These were relationships based not on obligation or shared history, but on mutual interests and genuine affection. With Margaret, I could have long, rambling conversations about history and politics. With David, I could discuss the simple satisfaction of creating something with your hands. With my fellow wordsmiths, I could share my deepest vulnerabilities and be met with understanding and encouragement. We were a tribe of individuals who had all lived full lives, and we had come together to write our final, most interesting chapters. But the most precious relationship that deepened during this time was the one with my granddaughter, Lily. After I moved, I had called her directly, explaining that I had a new address and a new phone number. I didn't tell her the whole story about her parents, not wanting to put her in the middle of a conflict she hadn't created. I simply said, Grandma needed a change of scenery. A few weeks later, she called me. Mom said I can't visit you anymore, she said, her voice small and sad. She said you're being difficult. My heart ached for her, for the loyalty she was being forced to navigate. Lily, darling, I said, my voice gentle but firm. My door is always, always open to you. Your mother doesn't get to decide who I have in my life. And she doesn't get to decide for you, either. Not really. It took a few more weeks, but one Saturday afternoon, a taxi pulled up to my bungalow, and out stepped Lily, her school backpack slung over her shoulder. She had used her own allowance to pay for the ride. I threw my arms around her, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. Her visits became our regular secret. She would come every other weekend, and we would fill our time with simple pleasures. We worked in my little patio garden together, her small hands carefully potting new flowers. We baked cookies in my new kitchen, laughing as we got flour on our noses. We would go to the community pool, and I would watch her swim with the joyful abandon of youth. But most of all, we talked. She would tell me about school, about her friends, about the books she was reading. And I would tell her about my life, the real stories this time. I told her about growing up on a farm, About meeting her grandfather, about my dream of becoming a writer. I read her pages from my manuscript, and she would listen with a rapt attention that my own children had never afforded me. "Wow, Grandma," she said one afternoon, her eyes wide with admiration after I read a chapter about Eleanor starting a new life. "She's so brave." "She's just a woman who decided she was worth fighting for," I replied, my eyes meeting hers. Lily understood me in a way no one else in the family ever had. She didn't want anything from me, except my time and my stories. She valued my wisdom, she cherished my presence, and she loved me unconditionally. She saw me not as a function, a babysitter, a cook, a source of funds, but as a person. Her love was a cleansing rain, washing away the years of feeling unseen and unappreciated. In my new community, surrounded by friends who respected my mind and my spirit, and in the quiet, precious moments with my granddaughter, I was building a new family. It wasn't a family bound by blood, but one bound by choice, by shared values, by genuine connection. These were authentic relationships, free from the toxic tangle of guilt and expectation that had defined my past. I was learning that true belonging isn't about being needed for what you can do for others, it's about being valued for who you are. And in the warm, accepting light of these new relationships, I was finally, truly, beginning to bloom. The inevitable confrontation came on a bright autumn afternoon. I was on my patio, pruning my rose bushes, when I saw them walking up the path to my bungalow. Mark and Susan. They looked out of place in the cheerful, serene atmosphere of Willow Creek, their city clothes and tense expressions a stark contrast to the relaxed contentment of my new life. My first instinct was a jolt of the old fear, a tightening in my chest. But then I took a deep breath, put down my pruning shears, and stood up to face them. I was not the same woman they had last spoken to. "Mom," Susan began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your new place is cute. A little small, though, isn't it?" "It's perfect for me," I said, my voice even. I didn't invite them in. I remained on the patio, creating a physical boundary that mirrored the emotional one I had built. "We were worried about you," Mark said, taking over. His tone was one of practiced sincerity, the kind he probably used on juries. "You just disappeared. Sold the house, changed your number. We didn't know what to think." "I didn't disappear, Mark. I moved," I corrected him gently. "And I informed you of my decision to handle my own affairs. You chose not to respect that." "We were just trying to help," Susan interjected, her voice rising with a familiar note of indignation. "We thought you were having some kind of episode. We even found out you changed the will. You cut us out, Mom. After everything we've done for you." "Everything you've done for me?" I asked, a genuine curiosity in my voice. "Please, enlighten me." They looked at each other, momentarily flustered. "Well, you know," Mark stammered. "We visit." "Do you?" I asked quietly. "Or do you just show up for holiday meals that I spend weeks preparing? Do you call to see how I am, or do you call because you need something? Do you know what my favorite book is? Do you know that I've started writing again? Do you know anything about me at all, besides my bank balance?" A flush of anger crept up Mark's neck. "This is ridiculous. We're your children. You owe us." "I owe you nothing," I said, and the words came out with a strength and serenity that surprised even me. "My debt was paid. I raised you. I loved you. I supported you. I gave you the best years of my life. The transaction is complete. What I have left, my time, my energy, my money, my love, is now mine to give as I see fit." "So you're giving it all to Lily?" Susan sneered. "You're turning her against us." "Lily loves me for who I am, not for what I can give her," I said, my voice softening as I spoke of her. "I'm not turning her against you. Your own actions are doing that. She sees the truth, and children are far more perceptive than you give them credit for." I looked at them, at these two strangers who had grown up in my house. I didn't feel rage anymore. The fire had burned down to calm, glowing embers of resolve. I just felt a profound and weary sadness for what we had lost, for what we could have been. They hadn't come here for a reconciliation. They had come to reclaim a possession. They had come to get the ATM working again. "I am building a new life here," I said, my voice firm, final. "A life filled with peace, respect, and genuine affection. There is no room in it for manipulation or greed. I wish you both well, but my decision is made. The boundaries I have set are not negotiable." Mark opened his mouth to argue, to threaten or cajole, but he must have seen something in my eyes, a calm strength he couldn't bully. He closed it again, a look of grudging defeat on his face. Susan just stared at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. Without another word, they turned and walked away. I watched them go, two figures receding down the sun-dappled path, until they were out of sight. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, just a quiet, clean sense of closure. I picked up my pruning shears, the cool metal a comforting weight in my hand. I turned back to my roses, snipping away a dead branch to make room for new growth. I had faced the ghosts of my past, not with anger, but with the serene strength of my reclaimed dignity. And I had won. Not by fighting, but by simply refusing to play their game anymore. The years that followed were the most peaceful of my life. The dust from my old life settled, and the ripples from the stones I'd thrown calmed into a glassy, tranquil surface. My days at Willow Creek were filled with a gentle, joyful purpose. I was no longer living in the shadows, I was basking in the sun. I continued my volunteering at the library, my writing, my pottery classes. I traveled, taking small trips with Margaret and my other friends, a bus tour to see the fall colors in New England, a weekend trip to a jazz festival. These were adventures I had once only dreamed of, now made real by my own choosing. My story, the one I had started writing in a torrent of pain and anger, evolved. It became less about the bitterness of the past and more about the grace of the present. It became a story of resilience, of an older woman finding her voice and her value. The Willow Creek wordsmiths encouraged me to submit it to a literary journal that specialized in senior voices. To my astonishment, it was accepted. Seeing my name in print, my words on the page for others to read, was a validation that went deeper than any financial security. It was proof that my story mattered. Mark and Susan never tried to contact me again. I heard snippets of their lives through the grapevine of distant relatives. They were fine, living their busy, self-absorbed lives. Sometimes, a flicker of the old maternal ache would surface, a wistful sadness for the relationship I had always wanted with them. But it was a fleeting ghost, quickly banished by the solid, comforting reality of the life I had built. I had learned that you cannot force people to love you or respect you. You can only choose to surround yourself with those who already do. And I was surrounded by love. My friendships at Willow Creek were the bedrock of my daily happiness. We were a family of choice, supporting each other through the small ailments and large joys of growing older. We celebrated birthdays, we mourned losses, and we cherished the simple gift of each other's company. My bond with Lily was the great love story of my later years. She blossomed into a bright, compassionate young woman. The trust I had established for her allowed her to go to the college of her dreams without the burden of debt. She studied literature, inspired, she told me, by her grandmother's story. She would visit me on her breaks, and we would fall back into our easy, familiar rhythm of gardening, baking, and talking for hours. She was my legacy, not in a material sense, but in the continuation of a spirit of kindness and strength. She was the proof that love, when given freely and nurtured with respect, will always find a way to grow. One evening, I was sitting on my patio, a cup of tea warming my hands, the manuscript of my first completed novel resting on the table beside me. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gentle gold. I looked around at my little garden, at the lights twinkling on in my neighbors' bungalows, and a profound sense of peace washed over me. I thought of the woman I used to be, the quiet, accommodating ghost who haunted the halls of her own home. I felt a surge of compassion for her pain and her loneliness. But I was not her anymore. The journey had been long and, at times, excruciatingly painful. I had to tear down the entire structure of my life to rebuild it on a new foundation. But the life I had now was authentically mine. It was a life built not on sacrifice and obligation, but on self-love and conscious choice. I had found my strength not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, resolute act of saying no. I had found my value not in the approval of others, but in the quiet satisfaction of my own accomplishments. I had found my happiness not in a full house, but in a full heart. The cool evening air brushed against my face, and I smiled. I had learned the most important lesson of all, that it is never too late to become the protagonist of your own story. And as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, I knew, with a serenity that settled into the very marrow of my bones, that I was finally, peacefully, home.